it's the panelists.
All right, welcome everybody. We took us a little bit of a second to get started. You would think this is our first one. It is not. We've been doing these webinars for over a year now, but every now and then you hit a little glitch. So we're going to let people join. We have a lot of folks that are registered for this webinar today, so I'm going to give it just a second and we will go ahead and get started. But if you're just now joining us, thank you so much for registering and being a part of this conversation today. I think it's going to be really good. All righty, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So good afternoon and welcome to our final discussion as part of a three-part series that we have been doing with the Martin School of Public Policy and Administration. I am Kate Shanks. I am Senior Vice President of Public Affairs for the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce. And this is a series that we started, a couple months ago because we really wanted to have a good conversation about the differences between our urban and our rural areas and just what we often refer to as the urban-rural divide. But what we really want to focus on in this conversation and in the others as we've done is really talking about bridging the urban-rural divide and helping people understand the strengths of the diversity across our state. And so we've looked at the unique needs for healthcare and education in urban rural areas. And today we will discuss economic development. So I'm really excited about this topic. I want to welcome our panelists from the Martin School for Public Policy and Administration. We have Dr. Allison Davis. She is Professor of Agriculture Economics at the University of Kentucky and the Executive Director of the Community and Economic Development Initiative of Kentucky. Also joining us is Dr. Merle Hackbart. Dr. Hackbart is a professor at the Martin School and Provost Distinguished Service Professor of Finance and Public Administration, and his research has focused on public financial management. And I can tell you, he is a former professor of mine and he really knows his stuff. So welcome, Dr. Hackbart, to the conversation today. And then on the legislative side, we have the co-chairs of the Appropriations and Revenue Committee, Senator Chris McDaniel representing Senate District 23, which includes part of Kenton County. He's the owner of McD Concrete, and Representative Jason Petrie from the 16th District representing Todd, Logan, and part of Warren County down on the Nashville border. I'm sorry, the Tennessee border. I always think of Nashville and I think of Tennessee down there. And he is an attorney. And so when we started developing the series, immediately I thought to myself, well, we've got to get Petrie and McDaniel on here because they represent two very different parts of the state, but they are tasked with forming the budget every couple of years, here lately, more recently, as well as handling any revenue legislation that flows through the legislative session. So I think they have very unique perspectives. Every now and then we have really good timing with these discussions. And late last week, the US Census put out new data, new information about how our counties are growing or how their populations are changing. And so we thought before we get into a good discussion, we would have Dr. Davis put up some slides and talk a little bit about that data and where we are seeing growth in Kentucky and where we are seeing declines in population, because you can't really have a good conversation about economic development without talking about people. And I think this is important context if you haven't had a chance to dive into that data to have this information. So I'll have Dr. Davis go ahead and, there you go, share the screen. Perfect, looks great.
Awesome. Can you hear me? You can see the screen. Wonderful. So technology is working on my end today. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. I just wanted to, Dr. Hackbart and I just wanted to provide an opportunity to showcase some of the heterogeneity across the state and our view in terms of there's rural, urban, and then there's most importantly different regions of the Commonwealth, and each has its own unique challenges and opportunities. But we thought we would just provide a little bit of data to get started. But first, looking at how we look at the state of Kentucky, and for us, it is while we're very county focused, and we still talk about our football games, our Friday night football games and the rivalries, folks looking from outside in really consider us as a group of regions. And
I think we have a tech problem here.
Oh, no.
I give it a second. She might, she fell off. She'll come. Oh, you're back? Go ahead.
Of course that would happen. Can you hear
It's
me?
okay.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you. It happens all the time. It's fine. If you want, I can put your slides up and that might actually help with your tech.
That would be good. Yes.
Yeah, and that way,
Economic
Dr.
regions.
Hackbart, you can fill in too, maybe.
Sure.
Okay, am I off again?
You're back, have at it. If it happens again, I can load your slides and that might help
Okay.
with your bandwidth.
Sorry about that. I'll try to get on a different one as backup as well. But the census data came out last week and provided a snapshot of what we've all been waiting for the last 10 years. And that's to see how population has changed in the Commonwealth. Kate, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. And so just to give you a sense, I'm not sure, there was an article in Louisville Courier Journal, there was an article in the Herald Leader that kind of provided sort of a more of a narrative around those population changes. And we wanted to provide just a quick overview of what the changes look like across the state visually. So you can see areas that are in Eastern Kentucky and back on the river counties lost population in some places pretty significant. Whereas as you get a little bit closer to central Kentucky, going through Bowling Green, up I-65 in central Kentucky in the triangle, you can see that there are areas that have had significant population growth. What we have seen though, is it's not necessarily an urban migration. While those areas like Jefferson and Fayette have seen population growth, largely the larger changes have occurred in those suburban areas. So places like Shelbyville or Oldham County, certainly we know that Scott County is growing down in Richmond. These kind of micropolitan areas, including Bowling Green, have seen pretty significant growth. And it's something that we shouldn't ignore. And so it's more what we call the burbs, the suburban growth. To see, where that has occurred. And you can see that all of the areas that have had the highest population decline fall within what we would call the distressed counties of Appalachia, including Cumberland and Clinton counties. Just to give you a sense of some of the differences across the state, median household incomes, these data are just a little bit old, just a year or two old. But not surprisingly, I think to anyone who's familiar with the Commonwealth, that there is significant differences in income. Eastern Kentucky, far Western Kentucky tend to have lower median household incomes. Areas near Louisville and Fayette County tend to be very high. Now, if you look in the conversation here about the range from Oldham was $102,000 down to Owsley and Harlan, which is around $26,000. So that is not a non-trivial difference in income. The rural areas of Kentucky have closed the gap a little bit in high school education attainment rates. And so there's less heterogeneity across the states when you're looking at those statistics. When you look at higher education, that is where we see a lot of variety. And again, not unexpected, areas that obviously have our regional universities, our state flagship universities will have higher education attainment rates. But you'll notice in Eastern Kentucky, the rates are very low. And in parts of Western Kentucky, the rates are very low, which we know, and there's a lot of debate around the return to higher education. But in terms of higher education or trades, it's something that needs to be considered. I would be remiss to not talk about some of what we consider to be really important contributors to our state economy. And while the conversation around mining, in particular in Eastern Kentucky and parts of Western Kentucky, it is still a very small component of our state's GDP. Agriculture kind of falls in that same category, although there are places that rely not just on farm agriculture, but because Kentucky is a place that attracts a lot of supporting services and industry. That cluster accounts for more than that share. But when we talk about Kentucky's economy, we're really talking about manufacturing and the service-based sector. And so we talk about the loss of coal. It's still a really small share of our economy, particularly over the last 30 years. So I think that was a really quick, I wanted to get through it before my internet got disrupted again. But just to give you a bit of an overview of how our state looks different. There are parts of it that look very similar, but how our state varies from east to west and north to south.
Thank you. That is perfect. And you can go ahead and stop sharing, and maybe we might have to refer back, but any general thoughts on this? Senator McDaniel, Representative Petrie, just thinking about your all's neck of the woods and how you've grown or maybe fallen in population. Can you feel those changes that we've seen reported from the Census Bureau?
Sure. Thanks,
Senator,
Kate.
go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And absolutely. And the biggest place that we see it in our neck of the woods is our labor force participation, which is dramatically above full employment, and also in our unemployment rate, which is dramatically lower than the national average for unemployment. The competition for workforce in Boone, Kenton, and Campbell counties, which is the kind of the northern tip of the Commonwealth, is tremendous. Wage pressures and inflation are a very real thing. So yeah, absolutely, it translates into every day where we're at.
Somewhat the same on my area, but very different from Senator McDaniel. Our manufacturing base is probably on par or less than our ag base, especially in Todd and Logan counties, and probably a good portion of Christian and Trigg. And you'll see that the higher education numbers are not there, but our unemployment is extraordinarily low. And for several months, we've been matching Oldham County or beating Oldham County in unemployment numbers. I love the slides. I'll probably talk with Dr. Davis a little further after this is finished, but you also have to understand topography and what we have as far as dirt. So you take South Logan, South Christian, South Todd, and Trigg. There is dirt in 2 or 3 of those counties, Pembroke 4 and 5 type dirt, that you can't get anywhere else in the world. So the value of that is ag based. Very high acreage prices. And so how do you get economic development in from manufacturing or professional services or something like that? Or even get residences built on property that's going 14, 16, 18, 20,000 an acre for ag prices. That's a unique circumstance we have, but yet we still have extraordinarily low unemployment, which is interesting to me.
Dr. Hackbart, any other observations on these slides? Something that jumps out at you?
Sure, just a few observations. First, I think the first slide, which had the economic regions, I think is a very important slide in terms of context, because it identifies areas of potential growth and the importance of urban centers in connectivity with its rural areas. Also, I think it's important for us to think about the fact that Kentucky is really just a geographical region. It's not necessarily an economy. Just like we have sub-economies across the state, in effect, these sub-economies are part of larger national economies. In fact, Kentucky is just part of the national economy. And increasingly so, Kentucky is part of the international or global economy. And I think that's certainly evidenced by the fact that exports are becoming an important component part of our gross national product. In fact, exports are also important. Kentucky, in fact, our exports are around $30 billion, which is about 15% of our gross state product. So looking to the future, and I think oftentimes when we think about economic development, we need to think about the future trends and their impacts potentially on our policies as well as our various communities. And in terms of the future, certainly it's important for us to reflect on the fact that we are part of the national and international or global economy. And the changes which are occurring throughout the world are going to affect our economies here in Kentucky, or our sub-economies or our major sub-economies. So the interconnectivity not only is between rural and urban areas, there's also great interconnectivity between those areas in Kentucky and our national economy and as well as the global economy. So looking forward, those national trends are important, and issues like technology, market access, flexibility, and certainly our urban areas have to give great considerations to trying to have the type of the economy which is very flexible, can change its composition in reaction to international trends and so forth. So I'd like to have us give a lot of attention to the future as well as to where we are today.
That's an excellent point. I'm glad you brought up our exports because we really punch above our weight when you consider the size of our economy and our population. I mean, we're typically ranked right up there in the top 10 in terms of the value of our exports. And so that's an incredibly important metric that we follow at the chamber, and seeing that as valuable to grow. So I think that's a really good point. And, you know, we do look inside to Kentucky, but we have to think about what's happening outside of Kentucky and how that's influencing economic development.
I do think one thing that we should, we've looked at these regions, and the urban parts of those regions very much contribute to the external markets. And in most of our very rural places, they serve more of our local constituents. And so having money flowing in is more of a challenge in our rural communities than it is in our urban communities. It's the same dollars recirculating when we aren't able to export out our products.
Just another thought, Allison, in terms of the charts. The trends which we're recognizing in Kentucky are simply very similar to trends nationwide. In fact, out in the Midwest, the Midwestern states, the migration from rural areas to urban areas, that's been in existence for decades. And it's a national trend which has existed for a period of time. And as agricultural units become larger, use more technology, the demands for labor in the agricultural sector become less, and therefore we may have labor surpluses, and those individuals move to urban areas where they have great opportunity to take advantage of their skills and education. So a lot of interconnectivity between rural and urban areas, not only in Kentucky, but throughout the nation.
I do want to talk a little bit, just sort of get your all's opinions on what, the ideal growth we'd want to see in Kentucky. We talk a lot about the Golden Triangle. So if you connect Louisville, Lexington, Northern Kentucky, you can kind of create this triangle of sorts where you would have population growth, economic growth. But what you see from this new census data, and if you see population growth, you're going to expect to see some economic growth there, people coming for jobs and using their talents and their skills. You see, Owensboro, Bowling Green, you start to see Paducah, you see that triangle pulling east along 64. And so if you could think through, Representative Petrie, I'll start with you, kind of how you'd want to see Kentucky grow. Is it better that we have people concentrated and that growth is concentrated, or do we spread out in Kentucky and create economic opportunities outside of that triangle? Are there certain areas of the state where growth is more difficult, and so it makes more sense to, focus over here, or do we get what we get based on the policies that are adopted?
Well, both. You're going to get some based on policies, and you're going to get some based on geography and populations. And so in that very beginning slide focus was brought back to, in my area, Nashville and Clarksville are as much a player, or the biggest players in our area. You take East Kentucky, they have a different synergy of economies over there. So when you lay out a statewide policy, you're not going to have equal benefits or equal effects. I don't think there's any way possible. For instance, we're always looking at Tennessee because we're so close to them, and people say, go to a consumption style model on tax like Tennessee does because their numbers look good, but their economies are very much different. Their tourism is very much different. The people that flow into that state by volume is tremendously different than what Kentucky has. So we can't do that. Likewise, in Kentucky, if you look at statewide policy and you have, let's say, business incentives for attraction of new developments. Okay, well, population centers already have in-made advantages. They have certain infrastructures there. They have certain workforce, certain university, higher education. Those things are already there. I think it is much better to try to spread those incentives and spread policies so that there's a greater incentive to spread out from population centers. And I'm going to use one example really, really quickly. Historically, there have been times over hundreds of years where population centers have undergone great great diseases that have come through, great catastrophes that have come through. When you have population density, there are certain disadvantages to that. Take COVID, for instance. In my area, spread is much more difficult because we don't travel as much. We don't have the population densities as much. But you take other higher population areas, density areas, the spread happened very, very closely, very, very quickly. And I think across the country, you hear people and you saw numbers on real estate where people started looking suburbs and past the suburbs. And can I get my 20 acres somewhere so I can enjoy nature more? I think we ought to look at trying to spread and make sure our policies are encouraging that spread. And from a good, really simple way of looking at economics and revenue and growth, you don't want all your eggs in one basket. And we have to realize we have multiple eggs in multiple baskets in Kentucky and craft those policies to encourage it, not to encourage consolidation.
Senator, do you agree? We need lots of eggs and lots of baskets.
Yeah, so my answer to your question was going to be a balanced economy is more important, to have these opportunities. If you want to take a very acute example, what do you think in your mind when you think New York City? Well, nobody thinks, well, there's good farming opportunities in New York City, right? Or, let me get some land and spread out in New York City. No, but I mean, you can think about Kentucky, and the impact of Amazon is yet to be fully realized. But I mean, sometimes people think about the urban areas in Lexington or Louisville or Northern Kentucky. They might think about our horse racing. They might think about our bourbon industries, aviation, a number of things. So balance is important. And also as appropriators, Representative Petrie and I, that balanced economy provides us a lot of stability in terms of the budgeting process. If any given area takes a hit. But, to Dr. Davis' last slide, there's a certain institutional arrogance that can set in amongst policymakers to overstate the influence of what it is that we do. I will tell you that probably factors like family locations, economic opportunities, lifestyle choices have a lot more impact on where people end up than necessarily policies that we drive from Frankfurt. Do we have some impact? Sure, but it's probably not anywhere on the first 3 to 5 of what people would necessarily rate. And, when you do look at that last slide from Dr. Davis compared to the earlier slides about population shifts, you really do see that as those opportunities in mining and agriculture go down, the population shifts away from those areas to where you do have different economic opportunities. But to Representative Petrie's point that he made earlier, one of the great miracles of the last century is our yields per acre and our crop production in agriculture here in the United States. And that's wonderful, but it also decreases the amount of jobs necessary to produce a bushel of corn or whatever the case may be. And so consequently, you see some shifts there.
Definitely. And I think that's what we've been seeing. And it's certainly a challenge for policymakers on how you design this. And I do want to talk a little bit about the interconnectedness of urban and rural economies, which Senator, you touched on. And I know we've got, large employers in the state. Thinking about Toyota in Scott County. Scott County's growing significantly, but you have people that will travel from outside of Scott County, many, many counties away to work there as well. And so there is this interconnectedness between our urban areas and our rural areas. And Dr. Hackbart or Dr. Davis, if you want to talk a little bit about that connection and why it's so important, because I think sometimes people see black and white here where, okay, you've got these urban areas, there's opportunity, everybody needs to go to the urban areas. But that's not necessarily the case, that there aren't already opportunities in the more rural areas, and that we need growth and opportunity in both to really thrive. So just general thoughts, Dr. Davis, on that, and then I'll ask Dr. Hackbart to comment as well.
Sure. I mean, I think we often overlook the role or this interrelatedness. Our rural places provide land. I mean, they provide natural resources. They provide the food that we eat. As much as we want to rely on, greenhouses and things like that, at this point, our land in Western Kentucky is amazing for producing the food that we need, both in Kentucky and nationwide and globally. So rural provides extremely important amenities. They are our workforce in a lot of our places. I mean, we can't, I think it was maybe it was Senator McDaniel who was saying, we have a huge workforce shortage, right? And so we have to rely on our outlying communities to serve as our workers, or else we won't be able to keep our existing industry and we won't be competitive in attracting new industry. We have tremendous natural resources in our rural places. We have amazing natural amenities, tourism opportunities, and whether it's Red River Gorge or Kentucky Lake or wherever it is, that is really, really quite valuable for our state.
Just a couple of thoughts about interconnectivity. The official definition of rural indicates that Kentucky has a relatively high percentage of its population defined in rural areas. Whereas I think everyone we now realize, and we've been talking about the fact, the individuals who have chosen to live in rural areas may be employed in urban areas. So they just happen to be in that geographical area as opposed to being connected to that area because of their jobs or where they're participating in the labor force. So I think the interconnectivity is certainly important. And as we talked about earlier, we're interconnected with the national economy. So in effect, that connectivity is worldwide to some extent. So I think we need to keep that in the back of our mind as we look forward, because as we indicated, exports are terribly important to our economy, and individuals may make choices in terms of where they actually reside, regardless of where they're actually employed. So that interconnectivity is terribly important. And certainly rural residents go to urban areas for services, quality of life factors, and back and forth. So we simply, that's just the status of our economy. That's how we live.
Senator, for somebody that is in your district and is traveling around Northern Kentucky, in the hustle and bustle of Cincinnati area, do you think that they feel that interconnectedness? Do you think that they're aware of that? And do you experience it as a businessman and as a senator as you work on issues with other members of your caucus? Is it apparent to you that there is that interconnectedness?
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting dynamic, but in addition to running a concrete company, I happen to be the largest farmer in the 23rd Senate District. I would say that it's orders of magnitude under anything that our friends in the West would recognize. But, sure, because ultimately you can leave greater Cincinnati and be in a rural area within 25 minutes.
Yep.
And frankly, a lot of people do that. A lot of your growth that you've seen in Boone County is folks that want the advantages of a more rural setting, but will take advantage of jobs that exist in Cincinnati. A lot of the folks that work in Georgetown, like was referenced, they come from other areas so that they can live more rurally and work more urban. That's, so it's an everyday fact of life for a lot of us, and certainly yields to the richness of the experience of living here.
We would be amiss, I think, if we would not talk a little bit about the impact of the pandemic on this very topic. In effect, remote working, those of us, for example, in this seminar this afternoon, where we're working remotely, we're participating remotely. And I think the impact of this experience is going to be fairly significant in the future, because individuals will have the opportunity to live in the area that they choose, but still be employed and participate in the labor force in other areas. So I think we're not exactly sure how this will impact the future structure and the relationships between urban and rural areas, but certainly I think this experience will impact that. And I think it's still to be determined to what extent that might occur, but certainly this experience that we are all having in the future labor force will have the opportunity to work remotely to a much greater extent that those of us who are in the current labor force or are like in my case, at the end of my labor force participation rate activity.
Yeah, and I do want to talk about policy, and I know Senator McDaniel has had legislation this past year, which we supported, that would have dealt with remote worker attraction. I saw recently where the city of Paducah has some new programming for that as well, which I think is really interesting. And I'm excited to move on to the policy conversation, but I do want to ask Representative Petrie on the interconnectedness question, the reverse, where you represent more rural areas of the state, also into Warren.
I think it's the same experience that Senator McDaniel is talking about. I'll take Todd County. That's my home county where I'm sitting, located currently. We've got Clarksville 20 minutes away. I've got Nashville 45 minutes away. I've got Bowling Green 45 to 50 minutes away. Hopkinsville 25 minutes away. So if I want to go to Sky Pack and take an art center in Bowling Green, or if I want to do the same of multiple places in Nashville, I can do so, or Clarksville with all its amenities and things that go on, great. Roads are easy to travel. 6880 is great. I-24 is great. It's easy travel. People can go to work in those areas, get the amenities that they want. But I find that a lot of people want to live in a rural area where there's less congestion. You know who your neighbors are. You know who you're going to see in the grocery store. And I think it is very interconnected. So my policy push on this would be two things: broadband and high capacity, high volume roads. If you give us those two things, then I think people see the advantages of rural life.
I love those topics. You're speaking our language. And honestly, I just saw someone put broadband in the chat as you were saying it. So that was great timing. And that's a great opportunity for me to share. I forgot to tell you all, I can see the chat. So if you would like to share questions with the panelists or comments, please do so. I know several people have already done so. So if there's questions towards the end that we can get to, we will certainly do that. But you mentioned broadband and infrastructure, so let's talk a little bit about policy. And I'll start with Dr. Hackbar and Dr. Davis. When you look at those counties that are growing in population, and so we're seeing economic opportunity, or we're seeing some sort of resources that those people need if they're working remotely. What is some of the infrastructure, or what are some of the similarities in those counties? If one of you wants to take that, and then in the reverse, in those counties where we're losing population, is there any commonality in those counties?
I'm happy to take a first stab. So, I think it's important to talk about broadband for sure. We've seen the absolute importance of that across, whether it's for school-age children, for workers, for healthcare, it's absolutely essential. There are additional services that I think kind of make or break a community. And those would be quality public education, access to healthcare, and just sort of an additional grouping of social infrastructure items that require longer term investment to ensure sort of the viability of that community. I use this example a lot in communities that have recently lost their OB/GYN services because there's been a decline in population. And I tell folks, if I'm driving on I-75 and I see someone speeding up behind me with their lights blinking, I know that they're about to give birth to a baby. And so to think about how you're able to attract young professionals, young families, or retain families, thinking about healthcare is an essential piece of that. And we're seeing a lot of, with population loss, you're losing hospitals, using specialists. With that, it's going to be, also a loss of, population in the long run. So I think about some of those more social based types of infrastructure that complement, I think for sure, the more physical infrastructure needs.
Possibly another way to look at these issues is to look at it in terms of sort of two categories of action. One would be the determinants of growth. And as already has been discussed, certain regions have certain resource capabilities, natural resource availability, have a certain labor force, they have a certain amount of capital, and they have a certain amount of entrepreneurial skills. They exist in various parts of the state, but there's also the possibility for state action to enhance the capacity for growth. And those enhancements could be, for example, focus on education, which could be statewide. Also focus on infrastructure enhancement. I think it was mentioned that access to major transportation systems or major highway is certainly a major factor. If we look at the historical development in Kentucky, where the interstate highway system was placed has had a major impact on economic growth. And that's not only in Kentucky, but certainly out in the Midwest, where I'm from originally. The interstate highways, to a great extent, determined which cities were going to be winners and which cities were going to be losers. So infrastructure is critical to the enhancement of the capacity for growth. And in terms of economic policy of the state, I think one way to think about that is that, in effect, maybe the major role of state government is to potentially enhance the capacity for growth of the various regions. And that enhancement can take the place of, for example, investment in broadband, investment in education, investment in infrastructure. But the economy itself will pretty well determine, and the business transactions and access to markets. And again, going back to export activity and trade, the economy is sort of on cruise control to some extent. Market factors will determine which sectors will grow more rapidly than others. But I think to the degree that our policies can enhance the capacity for growth, so our regions can be competitive with their competitors in other states and other regions, I think that's a major area of potential focus of what the economic development policy can be from a state's perspective.
So, I have to bring up transportation because everyone else has, and it's one of our big issues at the chamber. I wouldn't be doing my job, but I think if you took the interstate map and laid it over, Dr. Davis, your map that showed the counties that are growing and the ones that aren't, I think you can see 75, you can see 64, you can see I-65, we get that I-69 corridor going and that designation in Western Kentucky, you would expect that growth too. Representative or senator, whichever one you want to take it, you want to talk about infrastructure. What do you think are some of the most important policies to create those enhancements that Dr. Hackbart mentioned? Senator, I'll start with you because,
so I'll touch on that first. And I think, and Dr. Hackbart gets to a very good point that we have to remember in the Commonwealth, which is that market factors do determine segments of growth. And those segments decide where to locate for a myriad of factors. But we cannot forget in the Commonwealth that we're not on an island, right? There are very competitive environments that exist across every border across this Commonwealth. And those competitive environments look very different. Down where Representative Petrie is competing with Tennessee looks very, very different than competing with Ohio and Indiana. And so consequently, you've got to be very, very careful as you begin to pull on tax levers, employment levers, so on and so forth, that you don't create a situation where you become an outlier in those environments, because it is so easy to be across a border, especially when you think about that 65% of your population and your jobs are already in a border county in this Commonwealth. It becomes very easy to make yourself uncompetitive. So you've got to be very, very careful. And to your infrastructure comment, sure, broadband is the interstate of the 21st century, no doubt about it. And I think that over the next 3 to 5 years, you're going to see a pretty robust, if not complete build out of that capacity with the amount of federal dollars that have flowed through at this point.
Representative, thoughts on certain policies that you would want to be a part of, or that you think are important for Kentucky?
There are many that are important, and I was watching some of the chat comments going on, and I would almost look at the doctors involved in this, and we all have anecdotal information that we operate on. And I always push back and go, what are the numbers? What's the data? I know what my anecdotes are. I live those, and people talk about them all the time. And I've talked about some here because of the locality of it. But I go back to and echo a sentiment from Senator McDaniel also, a very important work this session on broadband build out, trying to get to those last of last miles where market forces probably will not get to. I think the General Assembly has to keep that in mind. And I know that some of the chats are going, healthcare, education, yes, yes, and yes. But you also have to get down to just, at least in the rural areas, just the raw things that you deal with on a daily basis. If you live in a rural area, you necessarily have to have good roads, because there are instances where you will travel to a doctor or a hospital. You have to have a good road to get you there quickly and safely. Groceries, you have to get somewhere to get those. You'll grow them in your garden, but wintertime hits, you're going to do something. So the roads are just absolutely essential for those rural areas. I know they are in urban areas, but that is our lifeline to those things we have to get to. They're not a block away, not 3 blocks away or 14 minutes that direction. And then I saw comments, what about for young people, and somebody echoing broadband? Not only from a workforce perspective of remote workers, yes, broadband, absolutely essential. Also for recruitment of business of any size, broadband is an essential piece of that today. If you want someone to come in and build a residence and live and be able to communicate with their kids and their healthcare providers, you have to have broadband. So I go back to, I will mantra this, broadband and high volume roads. Those are 2 things that help tremendously, or they're necessary components to rural growth in particular. And anyway, I'll leave it at that. Those 2 things are just essential. I hope we continue to look at that. Education is always essential. But again, you either have to have a road to get to it, or you have to have broadband to access it. So I stick with those 2 things.
Excellent. And let's look at this chat for a minute, because I think there's a lot going on, and I see some folks in here that I think are from rural Kentucky that are speaking up as well. So I want to make sure we're getting to some of these questions. There's some conversation in here about wage. And I think that that's something that we see, at least in BLS data, maybe, I don't know if it's in the census data. At the chamber, our perspective on that is that wages have increased significantly given workforce issues. Senator, I don't know if you want to talk about in your district where you've seen so much growth and your workforce participation's higher. Are you seeing that wage growth go up? And then also, I guess, representative in a more rural area, are we seeing wage growth?
Yeah, so I can tell you for our region, which I would also go beyond Boone, Kent, and Campbell and encompass it basically those counties where driving to Boone, Kent, and Campbell is reasonable, right? So you probably get into a 10 to 12 county region, and then you become influenced by Georgetown and Toyota, which encompasses it there as well. Wage growth is just tremendous. You can drive along and just yard signs out for places, entry-level positions, no experience, no particular education. You're looking at $18 an hour with benefit packages. You get into places where if you work shift differentials, et cetera, we've got employers with $21, $22 an hour unskilled jobs and full benefit packages going unfilled regularly. And so wage growth is tremendous in the Commonwealth. And frankly, the conversations anymore about minimum wage and this, that, and the other are almost irrelevant, because the ability of even the least skilled to pick up $18, $19, $20 an hour jobs is just, it's there for the taking.
Other thoughts on wages? Representative, go ahead.
Somewhat similar. I see that, but I'll go back down to my particular area and in rural places that I'm familiar with which I'm familiar. If you have medium-sized or larger manufacturing or professional, larger industrial size operations, yes, you see wage growth. You see the offers, you see worker needs, benefit packages, and I can see the improvement there. Of course, inflation is kind of offsetting some of that feel right now, but you can see it in the offers in order to get their workforce in. But when you look at more rural areas, you don't have that type of industrial manufacturing base. And you see people without education beyond high school, or maybe a year or 2 after post, the wage growth is not as significant because you still have a lot of people in Kentucky that comprise that low skill market. You don't see mom and pops and small shops hiring a lot of people, and if they do, they're hiring in at minimum wage or close, because that's what somebody needs to do. So I'm not really seeing the wage growth on the lower skill level. I think there's some uptick, but I see the real wage growth in the higher skill level, or at least in what I consider bigger business operations that need those workers and need the talent and have to churn out the numbers.
And Dr. Davis, I'm getting a question based on your comment about doctors leaving the state and OBs leaving the state, and commenting on our liability climate in Kentucky. We talk about economic development, we can talk about tax policy, we can talk about infrastructure. Liability climate is a factor as well. Have you looked at, or does anyone else on the group want to talk about, that doctors leaving our state because of high insurance costs?
I have not looked specifically at the liability arena, but this is a nationwide trend that rural places are losing their specialists. And a recent article just came out about the OBGYN climate, and it is just an exodus towards urban areas. Certainly the liability climate is going to have a significant play, particularly for those that are self-employed, their own practices, where they're going to go be a part of a larger system and have a bit more protection. But from what I have seen, what just recently came out is that there is just an exodus from rural to urban, specifically with that specialist, which is, has significant risk and legal issues associated with it.
Yeah.
If
Sure.
you don't mind, I'm going to pop in on that one. Is that possible?
Sure.
Just very quickly, I don't disagree with you. See those trends. I have a lot of doctors that are clients of mine, and medical facilities that are clients that I've dealt with, and I stay in good contact with them. My wife is in healthcare for over 25 years, and we see the same thing in the medical communities in rural as we see in the legal community. General practitioners, incoming doctors don't want to be general pracs, because it takes too much effort, too much administrative effort, too much effort to stay on top of too many topics. And same thing for specialists. It is much easier for specialists as well as general practitioners to plug into a system that already exists. They don't have to deal with the Byzantine labyrinth of insurance reimbursements, the compliance regulations, and on and on and on. So basically you end up in a legal community as well as the medical, and medical is what we're talking about. It is much easier to get out of school, or maybe a year or 2, 3, 4 of experience, and plug into a system that says, here, this is where you show up. We take care of the insurance. We take care of all the administrative regs. We take care of everything. You simply plug in. Or your other option is what? To go and stake yourself in a rural community, not in an existing entity. Put your shingle out, put your sign out, and say, I'm taking patients. No one wants to do that anymore. So yes, you have the legal liability climate, but there's some argument that we're not as bad in Kentucky as you might think compared to others at this point. But I think there's also a quality of where do I want to be and which one is easier, and how can I make my money back on my loans faster. The numbers are readily apparent, and there's a system that will bring them in quickly in larger areas.
For sure. And I do want to talk before we run out of time about what some say is, I think, how do you all say it? The biggest policy document of the General Assembly is the budget. Did I say that right? And there is a question in the chat about COVID funds used for economic development. I think we're talking about the ARPA funds. And Dr. Hackbart, I'll start with you, because this is your area of expertise, is just thinking through, how the budget in general, not current one, but in a given year, as policymakers come together, how that could influence economic development in urban and rural areas.
That's a very small question.
We have 11 minutes.
Right. And
I think I gave you an idea for your class next time for one of your exams.
Obviously, it's a real challenge to analyze the answer to that question, because there are sort of multiple opportunities for the use of state funds. And I think if we're looking more specifically at the issue of economic development, I think if we think about economic development in the sense, it encompasses almost everything. I mean, the conversations we've had this afternoon, we've talked about healthcare, we've talked about education, we've talked about enhancing the capacity of local government, of local regions to participate in economic growth. But almost everything that Kentucky state government does in one way or another, directly or indirectly, impacts economic development in the broadest sense. So we can talk about specific actions, and I think probably what you're suggesting was focusing more on those specific types of expenditures which may have the most direct impact on enhancing economic development in the current time period. And of course, then we're talking about certainly transportation investment. We're talking about education investment. We're talking about broadband and technology. But certainly to the degree that we have healthcare programs, which improves the health condition of Kentucky citizens and potential employees, the quality of life considerations, whether it's recreational oriented or in a more broader sense. I think everything we do, in a sense, focuses on economic development. If we think about economic development as simply efforts to enhance the quality of life of Kentucky citizens. So I think that's what government's about. And that's the primary purpose. That's the primary goal of what we do. And so I think we can, from time period to time period, we might emphasize education. I happen to have been budget director when CARA was passed, and that was a major focus of that session. We spent a lot of time talking about different options and policies and issues. Different sessions tend to focus on different issues as well, and depends upon the specific problems and challenges we face at that time period. So I'll leave it up to colleagues in the legislature. I'll pass the baton. They're much more informed and much more actively involved in these issues, but I really respect the work they do, because doing budgets is not easy. Every decision you make to increase expenditures in one area means you're going to offset that in another area. So those are tough decisions. And I understand that it's a process, and we try to react to issues from time period to time period. But my basic point, though, is that everything we do, in a sense, impacts the future of the Commonwealth of Kentucky in terms of state policy, whether it's financial, regulatory, whatever. So it's a major challenge, and I certainly respect all the roles of our legislators in taking on that responsibility to deal with those issues.
Chairman, any comments on what Dr. Hackbart shared, or how the budget is used for economic development?
Sure. And there's two sides to Chairman Petrie and I's committee. We've got the budget, but we also have tax policy that flows through our committees. And you've got to remember, one of the biggest economic development tools that we have is the tax policy and the tax burden of the Commonwealth. And if you really want to debate about whether or not it is or isn't important, well, look at the economic development incentives we provide to different folks to try to incentivize them to be here. Because by and large, an economic development incentive for a given organization or an industry is an offset to their tax burden. And so we have to be very cognizant of the impact of that, but also of the things that we've not necessarily addressed, the pension liability being the biggest of them, and I had been relayed in previous years that economic development professionals from other states were quick to point that out about the Commonwealth and the fact that it had not been fully addressed and still continues to be an issue as a negative. Hey, at some point they're going to have to address this, and when they do, what does that mean for tax policy? Now, the good news is, by and large, we've begun the work on that. I think we've brought some stability to that conversation. But directly what Dr. Hackbart referred to, it's things we do and things we don't do that will directly impact our ability to do economic development.
Quickly, I agree. I take no exception of what they've said so far. And I come from a background of humanities, philosophy, economics. That's my background in law. And so I deal with people all the time, and human issues all the time. But I do think, as has been said many times before, the budget is the policy statement of the General Assembly. What you feed and what you starve, what you grow and what you kill. That it tells you what the most important things are at that moment. Thankfully, we get to, when I was chair of judiciary, you set policy for long term, 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 years out. What are the effects going to be? This is something I find refreshing on the A&R perspective with the budget. You get a chance to do it 2 years at a time, and you'll always do it again. And so you'll always reorganize your priorities. And I think you can look at each budget session and look at that, and it's a good historical document to go, okay, what was going on in that time frame? What were they seeing coming? What were they responding to? We'll do that in each budget cycle, and you can set policy all day long, but if you don't have money to put it into play, it doesn't work. It just will not work. So it becomes extraordinarily important. Now I'm going to go back to a very small point when you first asked your question. I think it came out of the chat. Federal money. Make sure everyone's clear. CARES Act money, which was a large chunk of money that came out last year, Senator McDaniel and I have nothing to do with that. That's within the discretion of the executive branch where they've applied it, where they haven't applied it, and how many hundreds of millions are holding right now for we don't know what reason and haven't divvied it out to help people. Don't know. ARPA, what came out this year, we appropriated about half of that, mainly for infrastructure, or if not exclusively for infrastructure. Senator McDaniel and I worked to get more money on transportation budget apart from ARPA. And we will look at infrastructure mainly for the remainder of ARPA is what I anticipate. There will be some other things, but I would anticipate that still being the main part. But if anybody's got a question about the CARES Act money, go to the executive branch.
Very good. And we are almost out of time, but I do want to throw out something that the chamber has been talking quite a bit about, which is tax reform. And we don't have time to get into a big tax reform discussion. But I know, Senator, you mentioned that and that you all handle revenue bills as well, and I think would handle any sort of major tax reform policy. So any general thoughts to close us out on how you might look at tax reform in terms of how it impacts urban and rural areas, or do you think it's more broadly based across the state and should be implemented statewide?
So tax reform is squeezing the proverbial balloon in a lot of ways. And it is a long-term and very difficult policy statement to make. I keep around here on my desk the front page of the 1905 commission, 1905 now, commission on tax reform, which says we're taxing the wrong things. Our tax code is structurally unfair, and our tax code is discouraging economic growth. Their words were much more elegant in that time, but they said the same things 116 years ago that we say today, and I guarantee in 116 years, they will say the exact same thing. Everybody across every political persuasion believes we need tax reform. Once you get beyond that statement, the disagreements begin. And ultimately, you've got to come to a consensus as to where you want to land and how you want to advance your economy. So sure, it's something that's an ongoing item. We took a very large bite out of it about 4 years ago. I would like to see us develop a more comprehensive long-term plan that reflects the shift to more of a services-based economy, the way we have seen it. But we'll just have to see how that plays out over the session.
Absolutely. Representative, you came off mute.
Oh, I didn't mean to. I can go back on. I'm sorry. No, I would reiterate what Senator McDaniel said, and I would also say that I said earlier, the budget every 2 years you get to rework it and adjust your priorities. Tax modernization, tax reform, tax modifiers, readjustments, whatever you want to call it. It is simply longer term monetary policy than the budget is. The budget is for every 2 years. You work the revenue side of it. It's a longer picture. You try to make both of them as efficient and prioritized as you can. But I've used this example with people, just like Senator McDaniel said, look at the end of my finger, say that is tax reform. We all agree that tax reform needs to be done. But everyone on this Zoom that's looking at the end of my finger is thinking something different when we say tax reform. And that's where the inherent unbelievable difficulty is. Tax he, she, thee, but not me behind the tree.
Definitely have a lot of work cut out for us. Well, we are coming up on an hour. I would love to hang around with you all and talk more about this. It's been very interesting. I think it's been an important conversation, and I really want to thank the Martin School for Public Policy and Administration at the University of Kentucky for partnering with us on this 3-part series. If you want to watch, if you didn't join us before and you want to watch our other webinars, we've talked about education, we've talked about healthcare, and of course this one, economic development, which has been recorded and we will be posting online. If you'd like to revisit this conversation, please be sure to do so. But big thank you to the University of Kentucky for partnering with us, and we will continue to talk about these issues. And a big thank you to our panelists, Dr. Hackbard, Dr. Davis, and of course our chairman, Representative Petrie, and Senator McDaniel. Thank you all for joining us today and sharing your perspectives. I knew this would be a good one, so we really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us, Kate.
Thank you all. Very good.
Take care. Thank you.